Hey everyone. Thanks for coming to see me again. Apparently I'm still welcome, which is always a nice thing. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Darren Wallace. I'm the lead IT systems engineer at 10x Banking. I've been working with Apple devices for almost 19 years now. Definitely feels a long time. Started out hardware repair technician, worked way through support, engineering via consultancy. I'm also one of the 5 London MacAdmins organisers, a meetup group based around London. And you can find me on Slack, Twitter, Mastodon, most things as a Daz_Wallace. And today, I'm here to talk to you about coping mechanisms for dealing with the frequent macOS updates via the use of testing plans. Although this is focused mostly on macOS, there's no real reason why you couldn't apply it to other platforms, pieces of software, etc. This talk's going to be from my own personal experiences, but I've tried to keep it as generic and reusable for everyone else as possible. By the end of the talk, I'm hoping that you're going to be able to cope with the frequent update releases, ensure your business or organizational critical applications and controls work, instill confidence that your own rollouts will be successful and you'll have the minimum amount of issues, do all of that quickly, and finally provide a framework to share to others in your team. Something that's going to be crucial to allow you to go on leave or vacation without letting slip these standards that I'm hoping you'll be able to set. So it's always good to try and understand the reason or the need for doing something. So let's start with the why. To be honest, if you're here already, you probably have an understanding of the why, or at least how the why might refer to or be applicable to yourself. So the first part of the why, macOS updates. Apple releases a steady number of OS updates throughout the year, and typically for 2 years following initial release for every major version. These updates are not separated into bug fixes, security patches, and feature releases. You just get your one release per major OS per update. Most of those updates do tend to contain some sort of security patch. As a result, each update needs to be considered as potentially urgent and therefore required to maintain a particular security level. Now, personally, I kind of am a fan of this, as it's a good thing for end users, a bit of a carrot and a stick, you know. Hey, you want these cool new features, you want to see these new emoji your friends keep sending you? Well, you've got to install this update. Oh, by the way, you've been patched for a load of security issues at the same time. Bit of a win-win. Anyway, let's take a look at some numbers. So these are all sourced from Apple's own knowledge base article. That's 201222, and are accurate at the time of writing the talk, which may have been earlier this month, but before the last batch of updates, annoyingly. I've also excluded rapid security response patches and Safari patches just to make the numbers a bit easier and not have a thing going off the slide. So for this previous version of macOS, that's macOS 13 or Ventura, we've had 19 releases. Of those 19, all but 2 have had some mention of a security patch in there. So roughly 17 of the 19 had something you're probably going to want to get out there sooner rather than later. Over that 18-month period, that works out roughly just under 1 security-related update patch a month. What about macOS Sonoma? More numbers. So again, same knowledge base article, around the same time when I wrote the talk that this is accurate. There's one more entry at the bottom there, basically. So for the current major version of macOS, it's macOS 14 or Sonoma, we've had 10 releases. Of these, again, all but 2, weirdly, have some mention of a security patch. So over the 7-month period of these updates, that's a little over 1 security-related patch a month. Just a little side note. I'm sure some of you remember this document, and specifically this bit. This was added roughly 18 months ago and confirms the opinion that many MacAdmins had that only the latest version of Apple's various OSs are fully patched against all known security issues. As a result, we should really consider the latest version of macOS to be the most patched for security concerns. Also, though, if you do keep to the latest major version of macOS, it's going to make your compatibility with brand new kit a lot easier. Newly released hardware will only support the latest version of macOS that it's shipped with or newer. If you're behind on the current OS for your fleet, and you have a sudden need to buy new equipment, you're going to have to very quickly retest your whole setup, all your configuration, your deployment workflows, etc., to see if you can actually support the things that someone spent a load of money on. Talking these major releases, so it's coming up to that time of year again. Every year, for the last good while, Apple have worked on a yearly release schedule for OS major releases. Timeline is roughly announcement at WWDC around June time, and with that, an initial beta release. Various betas between that stage and the full release, and then a full release around September or October, typically. Now, each of these major releases can be an entirely huge rewrite of the whole OS, or just some minor tweaks. Snow Leopard springs to mind, or some sort of variation in between. We do also have a mid-cycle feature release around the first few months of the year, commonly known as a spring release, at least in this northern hemisphere. And that tends to have some hefty changes in features, that kind of thing. So tying it all together, what is the why or the need that we're trying to solve here? Apple released an average of 1 security-related patch per month per major OS. Apple have 1 major release per platform per year, although you could argue it's 1.5 with a spring release. Each major release can have any number of betas with changes, plus any number of betas for the minor updates. And ideally, you're going to want to skip to the next slide because I pressed the button too early. Apologies on that one. So ideally, you want to be able to confidently test these things and certify these patches with a minimum amount of issues. And that's also going to enable you to support the latest and greatest hardware at extreme to zero notice. What about for us specifically? Why did we want to build out some testing plans? Well, internally, there's a strong push to get any security patches out quickly, which, as you can imagine, is not a bad idea. There's also a push to not break things when we do, which generally is considered a good idea. And for our internal team, we wanted to give ourselves the belief that when we go into these users and saying, hey, you need to update your Mac, we need you to update this quickly and like now, that we're confident that we'll be able to not cause them any issues, they'll be able to continue to work, and we're going to have the data to back up that trust. And to deliver all that, we need to properly figure out what we should be testing, how, and when. Right, and how are we going to deal with all this? Well, I kind of spoilt it. We're going to use testing plans. So, what about the what? What is a testing plan? Good question. It's not something most people are familiar with as a term necessarily, but I know a significant number of people may be doing some sort of variation of it. So if anyone is not quite sure, you could consider a testing plan as a blueprint for a testing process. It outlines the major areas of concern, how to carry out your testing, what constitutes a successful test, which actually sometimes can be an error message, and a record of who carried out that testing, which is great for things like audits, SOC 2, ISO, et cetera, delve into some key considerations of a testing plan. So what you're going to want to try and do is to capture everything that's going to be critical to your organization to function and your users within it. Now, in a lot of cases, a lot of it's going to be unique to your kind of setup and what tools you use, how you do things, et cetera. But there is some common themes that I hopefully can share with you to give you a leg up into that one. It's very important to note you will not have time to test everything. As helpful as that would be, you're not going to have a chance to test every single workflow in every single application for every single department. It's just not practical. Try to focus on the core things that would stop your business from operating, or your organization. And that testing plan isn't set in stone. Feel free to tweak it and add to it over time, especially if you, as a new area, and you put functionality opening up that you want to limit perhaps or enable, or if you experience a specific issue in the past and you want to just make sure you're not going to tread over old ground with that. You can also remove tests that are no longer relevant or applicable. Might be quite obvious, but it's worth noting that. So what would I recommend a test has? Just to get really boring into the weeds. So almost all these tests can fit into a pretty good template of the same sort of template really for all of them. Normally you would jot these down in note form as like a bit of a draft, and then you could expand upon them and formalize them a little bit later on. But I generally consider the name of the test, quite obvious, a summary of what we're testing. And this summary is important because it gives context to the intent behind the test. If in the future you need to review or adjust that test, that context is going to help you understand why you might be doing it. Details of how to carry out that test. This one helps to ensure you've got consistency every time you run the test, whether it's yourself, colleagues, that sort of thing. Details of what counts as a successful test. That one sounds obvious, but in some occasions it can be unexpected. For example, if you're testing your web filtering solution, a block message for a particular website is expected, but perhaps an SSL error isn't. In this example, you would explicitly state, this is the expected error message, anything else is actually a fail. Then who carried out the testing, what date it was testing, and one of the more important things, whether it passed or failed. Let me run you through an example or two. So first example, let's go back to that web filtering. So name, web filtering, summary, confirm the filtering solution is allowing and blocking specific sites as expected. How are you going to test that? So open Safari, try to get to apple.com, try to get to skybet.com, try to get to macad.uk. Repeat that again with Google Chrome. What's your success criteria? Apple.com's fine, loads normally as expected, no errors. Skybet will show a block message for your specific filtering solution, and Macad loads successfully. Who tests it? Darren. At date, outcome, pass, fail. Just go for one more example just to help explain it a bit better. For this one, we're going to do MDM enrollment with Jamf Pro. So name, MDM enrollment. Summary, confirm the device has a successful MDM enrollment with Jamf Pro. How to test. So once the device is at that login window, locate that device record in Jamf Pro, find the MDM capability, enrolled via automatic device enrollment, if you're using that, and use approved MDM fields on the general tab. Success criteria. Your record's in Jamf, MDM capabilities, yes. Enrolled via automatic device enrollments, yes. Use approved MDMs, yes. Name, date, outcome. You might then have subsequent ones for, did the Jamf binary go down? Did a specific profile or profiles go down, et cetera, et cetera. Hopefully those examples will give you an idea of what I'm rambling on about. But what about the annoying thing? What if you do hit these failures? So first of all, quite an obvious one, record it in the test. Make sure you note in the test that you've had that failure. If you need to delay the release of an update to your fleet, then that will give you the reasons why, rather than having potentially a wishy-washy answer to go to management or security or whoever. Next up, if you don't already, I'd suggest logging a ticket to work on the issue. That will allow you to do your updates, to make your communications quite obvious, and potentially to hand that over to someone else to actually do the work for you. Once logged, start to do your basic troubleshooting. Try and recreate that issue. Perhaps there was just a random little fluke, and actually it's not an issue, just a random happenstance. Maybe it's an intermittent issue. Maybe you didn't actually do the testing properly. It just verifies that there is actually an issue there to be worked on. And the fun part of that is if you can recreate that on demand, you're going to get so much work out of just troubleshooting it so quickly. And then after that, start working that issue. Start trying to figure out where the issue lies. Is it a bug in the OS that you're testing? Is it a change in behavior that you're going to need to maybe tweak your configuration or your documentation or your process? Is it a bug or a change that a vendor of yours is going to need to deal with? Well, once you've identified those sort of things, the good thing is to provide feedback to the relevant people. If the issue's with Apple's OS changes, perhaps, you've got Apple's Feedback Assistant. That lives in System Library Core Services applications. You can find it with Spotlight, or as I learned earlier today, Apple Feedback // in Safari seems to work on anything Apple. And that will just pop up the Apple Feedback Assistant, regardless of whether you're on a Mac or, well, it worked on my Mac earlier and it worked on my iPhone earlier, so Darren approved. What about you've also got access potentially to a feedback channel in Slack. This allows you to perhaps have a bit more open conversations with other people who are also testing betas without any NDA risk or any of that kind of stuff. And just to be clear, to get access to that, go via the Appleseed public channel in Slack, and they will help you out getting you access to the private channel. What if it's an issue with a vendor, the vendor needs to sort out? Log your tickets with those vendors. Reach out to those account managers that you have with those various vendors. Some may refuse support because it's beta OSs or testing or that kind of thing, or they have some sort of timelines. Some may actually be even less than helpful, but at least you'll put it on their radar. They can at least potentially take that to their dev teams. And the more customers that are raising these requests or these issues, the more attention they're likely to get. Right, so hopefully I've convinced you to try out testing plans, but where should you store these things? Where should you use these things? This is going to be highly dependent on what you have available. You're going to need to have something that's going to allow you to set up a number of template tickets or tasks and be able to duplicate them and then work on them, add comments, that kind of thing. Something like Elastic Jira is not too bad for this. You can kind of have like a macOS testing top level, the specific OS you're testing as a child of that, and then all the tasks as children of that even. You can then clone it and do all kinds of fun and games. Alternatively, most ticketing systems allow you to create template tickets, clone them, duplicate them, and you can use those. Failing that, even a spreadsheet will work. Stick it all in a template workbook at the start, clone or copy that workbook over, rename it to the OS you're testing, and run through it. So many options that should be available. Let's move on to one of the bigger questions. What should you test? As mentioned earlier, it's going to be, or some elements are going to be specific to your environment and your setup. But these are a few areas that I consider a bit more generic, or I've been able to make them a bit more generic, just to give you some ideas. For example, MD enrollment, we mentioned that earlier. User authentication, are you using a login window replacement solution? Are you binding to directory? You poor person. Your build deployment solution, are you using dep notify? Are you using Swift Dialog, et cetera, et cetera? Your branding, are you setting desktop backgrounds, wallpapers, user icons? Are they still working? Your web filtering, we spoke about that. Your communication tools, Slack, Zoom, Teams. Can you do phone calls? Can you do remote shares, that kind of thing? Your hardening configurations, your CIS benchmarks, your Jamf security baseline, if I remember my terms correctly. Your other security tools, your AV, your anti-malware, that kind of thing. Your remote support tools, TeamViewer, BombGuard, can you actually connect to devices and provide support should it all go wrong? And what about your processes or your policies or even your documentation for your in-place updates and upgrades? Has anything changed that means you're going to need to redo those? And because I'm a nice guy, I've knocked up an example testing plan in a spreadsheet shown here, mostly shown there. I've included all the common areas that give you a nice starting point in your own plans, such as does your freshly updated or upgraded device successfully know MDM? Does your management tool of choice install its additional components if it's a binary or other bits and pieces? Does your deployment solution, should you use one, successfully launch unprompted when needed? Are you able to successfully register your device against your device compliance or posturing solution? Does that status update automatically when the status of your device changes? And even things like your dock configuration. Should you set this? Does it work as expected? Is there any question marks or unexpected icons? Like, for example, with the way that Safari was moved into a different location, the old dock configs would show a little shortcut icon on it. All little indicators that there might be something you need to dig into a bit further. Copy of that spreadsheet is going to be linked on a blog post for this talk that I'll have a link to at the very end, should be going live in the middle somewhere. But that's going to hopefully help you form your own testing plans quicker and more easily. And if that's not enough, Apple do actually provide an extremely detailed testing plan template themselves. I strongly suggest taking a look at this and perhaps stealing, borrowing bits from it, or using it wholesale. That's what it's there for. And that's available on the Appleseed for IT pages, accessible via beta.apple.com. You need to use a valid managed Apple ID to get to it. But yeah, it's just on the resources page. You can scroll down, and definitely worth looking at. But I'll probably put a pot of coffee on, because it's quite long. Not as long as this talk, hopefully. So, are there any other use cases for testing plans? You spend all this time and effort doing all this. Are you really only going to run it once or twice a month? Well, it's a great tool for other things as well. If you're making big changes to your management solution, you can use your testing plan to just double check you haven't broken anything. Confirming changes to your deployment workflows. So are you maybe switching from dep notify to Swift dialog? Are you redoing loads of chunks of code? All that kind of thing. Testing new hardware, like the whole Apple Silicon thing. That was a huge change. A lot of vendors were quite slow, shall I say. You need to test to make sure that you're not going to roll out a load of devices and find out half of them won't encrypt properly or won't report in properly. They also form a great list of topics for knowledge transfer, training, and documentation. Sorry, I couldn't get through a talk without mentioning the D word. So, we've covered why you might want to look into testing plans and what they actually are, but who should be running them? So my suggestion would be that whoever is the subject matter expert or responsible party for your Apple estate, which in most cases I'm assuming is the people here, but do that at least for the first few times. That's going to allow you to test your plan, make sure it works, it makes sense, it's not a load of gibberish, you haven't forgotten something or made a load of assumptions. Once you've got things up and running, it's time to share that love. Do you have other Apple admins on your team? Ask them to run a few with you next time. If you don't, but you have other IT staff members who perhaps are showing an interest, drag them into a few testing runs. This is going to allow you to not only share the skills and knowledge, it's going to remove yourself as a single point of failure for this process. It's going to allow you a better chance of being able to go on leave or vacation without having to bring your whole testing rig with you, just in case. Right, so you and your deputy are on standby and ready to go. When should you trigger this testing plan? There's two main events that I would consider should always trigger your testing plan. And that's a new OS update release and a new OS major upgrade release. So as we've seen, OS updates tend to happen monthly on average. Although I do need to stress they could actually occur at any point or frequency depending on the need as decided by Apple. So just bear that in mind. No patch Tuesdays as far as the Apple side of the house goes. Additionally, that spring release can be pretty major, so that's worth keeping an eye out for as well. Those OS updates for this side of the world tend to come out around 7 p.m. So if you're bored like me in front of the TV, checking out Slack, and you suddenly see you've got some more work to do. So I would suggest starting work on your testing plan the following day, whenever possible. And that should allow you to certify that update internally within a few days. I'd obviously suggest that you set those expectations with your relevant managers or teams that you might have to just suddenly get cracking on this at short notice. So what about for new major releases? So they're announced and initial betas are released at WWDC, which is around June time. Couple of weeks time, if that, for this year's one. That full release has a tendency to be around September, October, and again, tends to be about 7 p.m. UK time, depending on CDNs. For this, same sort of recommendations as your minor updates. Aim to start testing as soon as that's released, like the following day, if you don't work stupid hours. And aim to certify that release as soon as possible, within reason. What about betas? Look, I'm going to be honest with you. Should you be testing all the beta releases? Yes. Are you lucky to have time to test any of the actual releases, let alone extra work to test all the betas as well? Yeah, probably. I'm in the same boat. At a minimum, though, I would really strongly suggest to aim for test the major OS versions, the major releases, at beta 2 or 3 really heavily. Follow up by running your usual testing plans every time there's another subsequent major upgrade beta, plus any additional things that you may have discovered with your full-blown testing. And then try and test the betas for the minor updates if you can, but concentrate if it's one or the other on the release of these updates. Right, time to put my money where my mouth is. Oh yeah, we are using it. Huge shout out to Ewan, who was the main instigator of this internally. he kind of kicked it off and did most of the donkey work, and I swept in and just took all the praise. So internally, we now routinely use these testing plans for every macOS OS release that we support, most macOS upgrade betas, every macOS major release, most management platform changes or releases, and all major changes to deployment workflows. And what does that cost? So for each testing plan run for our testing plan, which is typically whenever an OS update is released, it takes about 4 to 8 hours total. Now, to be honest, much like most IT folk, a lot of that is loading bars. So you're probably looking at around 2 to 4 hours dedicated focus time working on this testing plans. Again, this is from us. What about devices? So typically we would use 2 devices. It's a bit more circumstantial in what we're testing, but typically we'd use one Intel device, one Apple Silicon device. And I really hope we can drop the Intel device soon. And that's pretty much it. That's pretty much what it costs to run this testing plan. And what does that give us? What does that allow us to deliver? So using the methods outlined in this talk, for every update and upgrade in the last 18 months, we've been able to complete a testing plan run within 24 hours of the release of an update, set a deadline of 7 days for a user to patch, utilize Slack and email communications to kind of make them aware of this, also use Nudge heavily to provide those ongoing alerts to our users. Huge thanks to Eric for that talk, it's absolutely amazing. And enforce a minimum OS version using device compliancy at those 7-day mark. Or the short version. We've been able to keep on top of security issues. We've been able to do so very quickly and confidently, and all with a minimum of disruption to the business. All this makes our security team very happy, our risk team very happy, and our business leaders extremely happy. However, it's not all sunshine and roses. Did we hit any issues with this? Well, yes. No system's perfect, and sometimes it's about looking at the risks of not testing a particular thing or a workflow versus delay to getting perhaps an important critical update out into your fleet. Examples of 2 issues we picked up using the testing plans. When we were testing macOS Sonoma betas, we found that the CIS benchmarks and Jamf restricted software uses the audit D process, and that was disabled by default in macOS Sonoma. Got the tickets in, and at least from my personal experience, Jamf got that fixed well before the public release of Sonoma, which is great. Another one, we had a blank login window when using a login window replacement solution. So again, that was a joint effort, I believe, between Apple and their vendors. They worked together, all sorted before actual release, which is great. Examples of 2 things that we missed or almost missed. So as was mentioned earlier, the Java runtime issues on 14.4. That was raised by some of our users, but actually didn't have any reports of that at all. So that was a nice little, nothing to worry about kind of thing. We were hit by the 13.3.1a RSR with some websites not loading that kind of stuff. But both Apple pulled that update quite quickly, and we had like sub 1% of affected users. It was a nice, easy fix. So it's not perfect, but then it's all about weighing up what you're testing versus the time. So, a little summary. Don't worry, I'm nearly done. The too long didn't read or didn't watch. Write out your testing plan now. Include any items of organizational critical things that you will need to test for each release. For each of those tests, ensure to detail how to carry out the test and what a successful result looks like. Train others on your team, if you're lucky enough to have a team, on that process, so it's not reliant on you. And plan to carry out that process, that testing, as close to each update's release as you feasibly can. Small plug. I don't know if you heard, but I'm one of the London Apple Admins organisers. So if you're an Apple admin or an Apple manager near London, and you have possibly a cool talk idea, maybe something you want to practice at a much lower scale, lower stakes, considerably smaller stage, if I'm honest. Well, I'm doing a good job of walking up and down it. That you want to test out. Or you've got a space that you could potentially host us in a meetup. We're quite a nomadic group. We like to move around to different people to host us. We'd love to hear from you. Feel free to use the details above in the form or DM myself on Slack. We can then coordinate, should you be willing, to either speak, host, or both. All right, that's it. Enough rambling from me. Got a link above for hopefully, if timing's right, yeah, it should be all right. A freshly released blog post with a copy of these slides and a link to the items mentioned. Thanks again to listening to me ramble. Anyone got any questions? Oh,
I'll run a mic over to you.
I know I said I wasn't going to be here, but I am. Do you use any form of automation for recording the results of tests? So scripting, whatever. So you've got your, I don't know if you're testing a VM or you test on a physical machine, have something running, have a script running in the background to automatically push the results of the test and screenshots and whatever out to anywhere? We don't. It's not something we've really looked into at this time, just because it's not that amount of disruption. It's sort of like, a couple of hours, and I can be doing tickets in between and stuff. It's definitely something that's worth looking into. I believe most solutions tend to be a non-zero cost, which obviously is then a naughty word. And also there is obviously a concern that you've got to make sure that what you're testing for the automation is a valid representation of what your users are going to be clicking and doing. Not a bad idea, not a good idea, I don't mean like that. Not a bad idea, a great idea, but there is things to just be aware of with it. But yeah, cool. Any other questions? Down the front.
Thanks, Des. If you do find issues like, for example, websites not loading, how do you balance kind of holding back the update to avoid that versus needing to get security patches implemented?
So I'm going to go with a nice safe answer of it depends. I would generally try and set myself a deadline to get it fixed, normally by the end of that day, or at least figure out a workaround. It might be just comms out to users and say, hey, you just need to flip to using, I don't know, Chrome instead, or vice versa. Ideally, you'd want to resolve it. That's not always possible. And if it's something you can't resolve and it is a business critical thing you're going to break, it's then a case of raising it with the relevant security teams, flagging it, and having those conversations. Because, for example, ironically, if it's a security tool, I don't know, causes kernel panic with an update, security team might have to make a judgment call on what's more important, keeping that security tool on there or getting patched something that's now out in the wild as a known thing to be poking at. Yeah, it depends. Cool. Any other questions? Sweet. Thank you so much for listening to me ramble again. It's been great. Thank you so much.